It started with that fishing trip we went on with his friends. I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but I decided that a little time alone with my husband, even if fishing, wouldn't hurt. My husband Michael was happy that I agreed. He tried to do everything to make me feel comfortable, and I, in turn, pretended that I was interested in this adventure. But that whole attitude changed dramatically when I saw his friend Daniel. Daniel was a tall, masculine man with a mysterious look that made my skin crawl. He immediately stood out from the rest. The moment our eyes crossed, I felt something shudder inside, as if it had caught on an invisible thread that stretched between us. I tried to ignore this feeling, writing it off as my fantasy, but every moment it became more difficult for me not to notice his presence. On board the boat, Michael explained to me how to hold the rod correctly, from which side it is better to cast the bait. His friends were laughing, exchanging jokes, but I couldn't concentrate anymore. Daniel was standing a little way off, lost in his thoughts, but from time to time I caught his eyes on me. These moments, short but full of meaning, worried me more and more. "Have you never fished before?" Daniel's voice suddenly sounded nearby. He came closer and stood in front of me, smiling slightly. "Never," I admitted, trying to stay calm. "This is new to me." "It's okay, everyone has their first time sometime," he said, handing me his fishing rod. "Come on, try this side. The water is calmer here." His voice was soft, almost mesmerizing. I took the rod, feeling his hand lightly touch mine. This contact was fleeting, but it turned out to be too obvious for me. Michael, who was busy talking to friends, didn't notice anything, but anxiety spread inside me. We stood side by side in silence, looking at the smooth surface of the lake. I tried to focus on fishing, but my thoughts kept returning inexorably to what was going on between Daniel and me. What is this strange attraction that I feel? Why is it now, in this place, with this man? "Laura, is everything okay?" Daniel asked, noticing my confusion. I nodded, but I couldn't find the words. There was a real struggle going on inside me. My mind kept saying that it was all fiction, but my heart screamed the opposite. And at that moment, I realized that I was already too deeply involved in this dangerous game. "If you need anything, just say it," he added, his voice sounding sincere. I looked at him and saw something more than just friendliness in his eyes. But before I could say anything, Michael came over to us, putting his hand on my shoulder. "Is everything okay, dear?" "What is it?" he asked, smiling. "Yes, everything is fine," I replied, hiding my confusion behind a strained smile. But there were so many feelings bubbling inside me that I couldn't control them. The whole day passed in a fog. I hardly participated in conversations, trying to figure out what was happening to me. In the evening, when we were returning home, Michael did not notice my detachment, still rejoicing at the successful fishing trip. But this meeting with Daniel was the beginning of something new, something that will haunt me in the days and weeks to come. I couldn't get him out of my head, his look, his voice, his touch. And although I knew in my mind that this was just a chance meeting, that I was exaggerating its significance, my heart was already living in another world, a world where Daniel and I played the main roles. It's been a long night. Lying next to Michael, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts darted from memories of that day to anxious thoughts about what might happen next. I knew I hadn't crossed the line yet, but I felt like I was already standing on the edge of it. In the morning, everything looked as usual. Michael was cooking breakfast, Clara was running around the house, but something inside me had already changed. This feeling of anxiety did not leave me for a minute, and I realized that there was no turning back. The days passed, but I kept thinking about Daniel. Any mention of him, a chance meeting in the city, all this increased my inner tension. I began to notice that even when Michael was talking to me, I couldn't fully focus on his words. Everything I heard was as if through a veil, as if I already existed in another dimension. And then one day, at the most unexpected moment, Daniel reappeared in my life. We bumped into each other in the supermarket parking lot. He was alone, and as soon as I saw him, my heart started pounding faster. "Laura, hi." His voice was warm and friendly, but in his eyes I saw the same fire that burned inside me. "Hi, Daniel," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. We only talked for a few minutes, but it was enough to ignite new doubts in my soul. He offered to meet me for coffee, and although I knew it could lead to something more, I couldn't refuse. In the evening, I was sitting at the table, looking at my family. Michael was telling some funny story, Clara was laughing, but I took it all as a background, unable to fully immerse myself in this moment. All my thoughts were about meeting Daniel tomorrow. I knew it was just a cup of coffee. Just a friendly conversation. But inside I felt that this meeting would change everything. This concludes the first chapter, leaving room for further developments that will turn the lives of Laura and her loved ones upside down. The next day, as agreed, I went to meet Daniel. Trying to stay calm, I chose my best dress, even though I told myself it was just a friendly meeting. Everything was boiling inside me, but I assured myself that I would be able to control the situation, that everything would remain within acceptable limits. The cafe where we agreed to meet was located on a quiet street in the city center. It was a cozy place where acquaintances rarely went, and I felt relieved to realize that it was unlikely to meet someone from our entourage here. Daniel was already waiting for me at the table by the window when I came in. His gaze immediately settled on me, and I felt a warmth mixed with anxiety spread inside. "Laura, it's good to see you," he said, standing up to greet me. His voice was warm, as it always was, but this time there was something more to it, something I couldn't ignore. "Hi, Daniel," I replied, trying to hide my excitement. "How are you?" We ordered coffee and started a conversation on abstract topics: work, the latest news, mutual acquaintances. I tried to act natural, but every time our eyes met, a spark flew between us that was impossible not to notice. "You know, I often think about that fishing trip," Daniel said suddenly changing the subject. "It was great to spend time together. You really enlivened that trip." I felt my cheeks flush and pretended to focus on my coffee. "It was nice," I murmured without looking up. "I'm glad I decided to go." "You seemed so lost in thought back then," he continued, leaning slightly toward me. "It seemed to me that there was something between us. It's special." My fingers involuntarily trembled. I barely held the cup. His words awakened in me those feelings that I tried so hard to suppress. At that moment, I realized that everything had gone too far, but instead of retreating, I only got deeper into this dangerous game. "Daniel," I began, trying to sound calm, "we both know what this is." "Laura, don't pretend," he interrupted, his voice becoming more serious. "I feel the same way you do. This is not just a passing infatuation." My eyes met his, and at that moment I realized that all attempts to hide my feelings were in vain. Daniel saw right through me, and it scared and attracted me at the same time. "Michael," I began, but Daniel gently touched my arm, silencing me. "We're not doing anything wrong," his voice was firm but gentle at the same time. "We're just talking. And no one will know if we want to continue." His words hung in the air like forbidden fruit. I couldn't answer because there was a storm going on inside. Desire and a sense of duty were fighting, and at that moment I couldn't predict who would come out the winner. "Daniel, this is wrong," I finally said, looking away. "We both have families, and I don't want to destroy what we have." He stared at me intently, without taking his eyes off me, as if trying to read my thoughts. "I understand, Laura," he replied quietly. "But tell me honestly, are you happy? Are you really happy?" This question hit me in the heart. I could have lied, said that everything was fine, that I was happy with my life, but the truth was that I hadn't felt really happy in a long time. My life turned into a routine, and this meeting with Daniel opened my eyes to what I was missing: passion, excitement, a sense of novelty. "I do not know," I whispered, feeling tears coming to my eyes. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. His touch was warm and soothing. "Laura, we can control our actions," he said. "I'm not suggesting you ruin your life, but what if we just enjoy what we have now? No one should know." At that moment, something in me broke. Perhaps it was fatigue from years of suppressing my desires, perhaps the temptation was too great, but I realized that I could no longer resist. Daniel was offering me what I craved: freedom, however temporary, however forbidden. I slowly raised my eyes and met his gaze. I saw the reflection of my desire in his eyes. We both knew that this game was dangerous, that it could destroy everything, but at that moment it seemed the only right decision. "Okay," I said softly, nodding. "But only if no one finds out." Daniel smiled, his eyes shining with relief and joy. He knew that he had won this round, and strangely enough, I also felt like a winner. We left the cafe together, and when he offered to give me a ride, I did not refuse. We didn't talk much in the car, but the tension in the air was palpable. I knew that I had taken a step into the unknown, that this decision would change everything, but at the same time I felt strangely relieved. Daniel stopped the car at my house. He turned to me, his gaze focused and serious. "Laura," he said, his voice soft, "I want you to know that this is not easy for me either. But I'm glad you decided to give it a try." I nodded, not knowing what to say. There was still a storm of doubt and fear raging inside me, but it was too late. He leaned towards me and, pausing for a moment, lightly touched his lips to mine. This kiss was brief, almost innocent, but it set off a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. When I got out of the car and closed the door behind me, my heart was beating so hard that I thought it would jump out of my chest. There was a swarm of thoughts buzzing in my head, but the main one was that I had started this game, and now I had to find out how far it would take me. It's been a few weeks since Daniel and I first met for coffee. We communicated through messages, sometimes called each other, but everything remained within the framework that could be called safe. However, with each new contact, I felt that we were getting closer and closer to the point of no return. It was a game in which both knew the rules, but no one wanted to be the first to admit that these rules could ruin our lives. Michael didn't suspect anything. He was so busy with his new business expansion project that he hardly noticed my changes. I was still the same Laura to him, wife, mother, business partner. But inside, I was no longer who I used to be. Disturbing thoughts visited me at night, but during the day I lived in a world where this secret game with Daniel seemed like the reality I had been looking for a long time. Saturday came, and Michael left for the day on business. Clara stayed at Grandma's overnight, and I was left alone at home. This moment of silence and solitude always gave me time to think, but this time the thoughts did not bring peace. Daniel suggested we meet at his place. It was an invitation that I accepted without hesitation. It wasn't just a chance meeting anymore. I knew we'd crossed the line. When I drove up to his house, my hands were shaking slightly. It was a spacious house in a quiet neighborhood, unremarkable from the outside, but inside I knew that something would happen here that would change everything. Daniel came out to meet me, smiling. I saw the same tension in his eyes that I saw in mine. He knew that this day would be special. "Laura, I'm glad you came." His voice was calm, but I felt the tension slip through it. "I'm glad too," I replied, trying to smile, but the smile came out uncertain. We went into the house, and Daniel closed the door behind me. Everything was so familiar, but at the same time completely new. Once in his space, I felt the air around us become thick, filled with tension. It was more than just a physical attraction. It was a feeling that something inevitable was waiting for us. "Maybe some wine," he suggested, pointing to the bottle on the kitchen counter. "Yes, it probably wouldn't hurt," I agreed, feeling a surge of excitement inside. Daniel poured us each a glass, and we sat down on the sofa in the living room. The silence was heavy, but not awkward. Each of us knew that to say now would be to destroy the moment that should have happened naturally. "Laura," he finally said, "I don't want you to feel obligated. Do something. We can just spend time together." I looked into his eyes. This man knew me better than I expected. He understood my struggle, my doubts. And it was this understanding that made him so dangerous and attractive. "I know, Daniel," I replied quietly, "but I'm not here to escape from reality. I want this." These words sounded louder than I expected. It was a confession not only for him, but also for herself. At that moment, I realized that I was crossing a line beyond which there is no return. Daniel came closer, his hand on my shoulder. It was a gentle gesture, but there was a force in it that made me shudder. "I want it too," he whispered, his voice warm and soothing. We froze for a moment, as if giving each other one last chance to stop. But that moment passed too quickly, and soon his lips were on mine. The kiss was cautious at first, as if testing how far we were ready to go. But soon the caution disappeared, giving way to the passion that we had been holding back for so long. Time seemed to have stopped. All fears and doubts disappeared in that moment. I lost control, allowing myself to drown in these feelings, to forget about everything except Daniel. His hand slid over my body, and every gesture he made was filled with confidence that made me dizzy. We got up from the couch, and he, without letting go of me, led me into the bedroom. At that moment, everything was said without words. I followed him without resisting, knowing that this was the moment when my life would be divided into before and after. Once in his bedroom, We no longer restrained ourselves. Everything happened quickly, but at the same time slowly, as if every gesture and every touch were important. Daniel knew what he was doing, and I gave in to him, forgetting all my principles, promises, and obligations. When it was over, we lay in silence, breathing heavily and slowly. I stared at the ceiling, feeling a sense of guilt begin to form inside me. But it hasn't filled all the space yet. So far, I've been enjoying what happened, sinking into a state of calm and contentment. Daniel turned to me, his hand gently sliding over my cheek. "Laura," his voice was soft, but I could hear the hidden anxiety in it. "Are you okay?" I nodded, unable to find the words. All I could feel at that moment was his closeness, his warmth. But deep down I knew that this was just the beginning of something that could destroy everything I've built over the years. It was. He began, but I stopped him by pressing my finger to his lips. "Daniel, you don't need words," I whispered. "Let's just be in this moment." He nodded, and we fell into silence again, but this time it was filled with the realization of what had happened. We both knew that this moment would change us forever. I couldn't predict what would happen next. When I returned home, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. I knew that I would never be able to return to the life that I had before that day. The line had been crossed, and now it was necessary to figure out how to live with this decision. It's been a few months since the day I first crossed the line. My life was divided into two parallel realities. One in which I was a wife and mother, ran our business and tried to maintain a semblance of normality, and the other, a secret one in which I lived, hiding my feelings for Daniel. Michael still didn't suspect anything, although sometimes I noticed him looking at me intently, as if trying to catch something that was eluding him. Daniel and I met more and more often, and each time it seemed to me that we were playing with fire. But I couldn't stop. It became a drug for me, a feeling of passion, risk, mystery. However, I understood that this world would not be able to exist for a long time. One evening, when Michael returned home earlier than usual, I felt a strange tension in the air. He looked worried, but tried to keep calm. We sat down to dinner and I tried to act natural, but his silence was too loud. "Laura, we need to talk," Michael said suddenly, putting down his fork. My heart sank. There was no usual gentleness in his voice, and I felt fear creep over me. "Of course, Michael. About what?" I tried to smile, but everything went cold inside. He looked at me intently, his eyes serious and full of determination. "Laura, I know about you and Daniel," his words came out of the blue. I froze. Everything I was afraid of has now become a reality. Time slowed down and I couldn't say a word. "I didn't want to believe it," he continued, his voice full of pain. "But then I noticed how detached you became, how often you were in your own world. I checked your phone. I'm sorry, Laura, I just couldn't help it." My hands trembled. Michael has never been one to invade personal space. This meant that his suspicions were so strong that he was willing to do anything to find out the truth. "Michael, I began, but the words stuck in my throat. How to explain something that cannot be explained? How to justify something that destroys everything he believed in? "Laura, I don't want to hear excuses," his voice hardened. "I just want to know one thing. Was it a mistake, or do you really feel something for him?" This question cut right through me. I knew that at this moment my fate was being decided. To answer honestly is to admit everything that happened between Daniel and me. To lie is to try to save the marriage, but already on a lie. I looked into Michael's eyes, and I saw pain and disappointment in his gaze. It was something I never wanted to see in the eyes of the man I once loved. "Michael." I took a deep breath. It wasn't just a mistake. He closed his eyes as if trying to process what he had heard. Silence hung in the room, and I felt the world around me crumble. "I get it," he said softly, getting up from the table. "I think you need to leave." His words sounded like a sentence. I knew he was right. It wouldn't be fair to stay in this house after everything that happened. But it was incredibly difficult to take this step. I stood up, feeling a heaviness in my chest. We didn't exchange another word. I went into the bedroom, gathered my things, feeling tears coming to my eyes. It was the end. The end of what I once thought was my life. When I was already standing on the threshold, ready to leave, Michael came up to me. His face was calm, but I could see in his eyes how he was trying to cope with the pain. "I never thought it would end like this, Laura," he said. "But if you decide you want another life, I won't hold you back." I nodded, unable to say anything. Everything inside me was clenched with pain and regret. I knew that I had made a choice that would change our lives forever. "Take care of Clara," I whispered before walking out the door. He didn't say anything, just closed the door behind me, and I heard the key turn in the lock. It was the end. I knew that now I had to start a new life, but I had no idea how to do it. Outside, I got into the car and sat in silence for a few minutes, trying to come to my senses. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't go back to Daniel. What seemed like a beautiful dream has now become the cause of the destruction of my family. I decided that I had to leave everything behind and start all over again, without Daniel, without Michael. Just one. This evening changed everything. I left town without leaving a number or an address. Now I had to build my life from scratch, and only time will tell how right I did.